Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and Leon Levy, the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will take place on September 28th at 6 p.m. in the Proshansky Auditorium here in CUNY. The celebrated biographer Walter Isaacson will be giving the annual Leon Levy Lecture on Biography, featuring his new book on Elon Musk. I have to say that this event is already filled to capacity, but it will be live streamed. I should also mention that on October 11th at 6:30 p.m., I will be interviewing on stage a little-known film director, Christopher Nolan. That was a joke. And his producer, Emma Thomas. Some of you may have seen his new film, Oppenheimer, which is based on a biography I co-authored with Martin J. Sherwin some 18 years ago. What can I say? But if you wait long enough, miracles happen even in the field of biography. But tonight I'm delighted to introduce Rachel Shteir, who will be talking about her new book, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. She will be in conversation with my old friend, Katha Pollitt. And I want to say that I actually knew Betty Friedan in Washington, D.C. She was a member of our little writers group, and we would meet once a month, and I would be her chauffeur. I would pick her up at her apartment and chauffeur her downtown, and she was a formidable character. But I loved hanging out with her. She was very funny. And at one point in our conversations, I was then working on Oppenheimer, she said, well, you know, I knew a few physicists. And then she told me this fabulous story, which ended up making its way into the book, about her love affair, dating, long relationship with David Bohm, the very famous physicist, who was a young physicist at the time in Berkeley and a student of Oppenheimer's. Anyway, I grew to really love and admire Betty Friedan, and so I'm really delighted to be able to introduce this event. Rachel Shteir is an award-winning essayist, writer, and critic whose work has been published in many newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. In addition to Betty Friedan, she is the author of Striptease, The Untold History of the Girlie Show, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, and The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting. She is founder and head of the Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism program in the theater school at DePaul University. Katha Pollitt is a poet, essayist, and columnist for The Nation, my old magazine for many years. She has written for many magazines and published numerous books, most recently Pro, Reclaiming Abortion Rights, and The Mind-Body Problem, a book of poems. Please look for all these books at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. So Rachel and Katha will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from our audience here. The people are watching this online, live streaming it, but alas, they will not be able to ask any questions. That's a little technically too difficult. But Katha will be sure to get to as many questions as she can from our live audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And now I turn this conversation over to Katha Pollitt.
It's wonderful to be here tonight celebrating the publication of this fantastic biography by Rachel of Betty Friedan. You know, I was thinking there've been quite a few biographies of Betty Friedan. This one is the one you should read, of course. But I'm curious, what drew you to this subject?
Well, about 10 years ago, I was asked to write an article. It was for the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique for the Chronicle of Higher Education Review. And the article was supposed to talk about the feminine mystique, and then it was supposed to talk about new books about feminism that had come out that year, which included Hannah Rosen's The End of Men, and also a book by Naomi Wolf. I'm blanking on the title of it. And so I set about writing this essay, and I read The Feminine Mystique, and it was the first time I had ever read it. And I was blown away by it. I had no idea. I didn't read it in college. And then I read these other books, and I was really struck by the fact that the other books, in one way or another, borrowed from or in some way were in dialogue with Betty without ever mentioning the feminine mystique. So I felt immediately like there was a kind of erasure going on. And so I wrote this article, and people really liked it. And out of that came this commission.
You know, I was thinking about that erasure, which is, I mean, most history gets erased, but at one point, Betty Friedan was probably one of the most famous people in the world. And now she has been not just forgotten a little bit, but also attacked a lot. When I was teaching at the New School, we read I can't remember, probably not the whole thing, but because it's a long book. But you know, it's racist. What's wrong with being a housewife? It's capitalistic. It's individualistic. All the istic words were there, and I thought that was so unfair. Why do you think this has happened?
Well, you just mentioned a lot of really great reasons why it has happened. In some ways, I think that second wave feminism is perceived as having left Betty behind in the 50s. And certain parts of the feminine mystique do not age well. For example, she does not talk at all about Black women or working class women. It is really about middle class white women, white housewives. And I think in our current moment, certainly that's one reason why it's not read. But I think well before our current moment, there was this reaction to it that it was somehow antiquated, that it used dated language, that it had dated ideas.
What I always took from it, besides her indelible portraits of the way women were infantilized, like I'll never forget, there was one about a baby shower or a wedding shower, and where women are saying, you can take this tape measure and measure your waist and see how fat you are, or whatever it was. I don't know why you were supposed to do this, but it was so childish and humiliating, and the idea that people actually were doing this. But then I went to a shower in our lifetime, and it was pretty much the same. It was just awful.
Yeah.
But what was I going to say? That the thing I took from it, besides its very mordant critique of what were then the way things were, was its emphasis on, it wasn't really about work, as in work for pay. It was about being yourself, being true to yourself, being that sort of Emersonian American individual that men have always been encouraged to be, and that women were encouraged to give up so that the man could be the Emersonian individual.
Yes.
And I thought that was just so wonderful, and something that is not said enough.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the feminine mystique is a lot of things. Part of it is a memoir in which Betty indicts herself for participating in the Feminine Mystique when she was a journalist in the 1950s, and she would go to editorial meetings where the editors would talk about how to pitch certain articles to housewives. So she, you know, to me, that's a very compelling thing about the book, that she talks, there's the narrative is of somebody who was deep in the world where this was happening to somebody who saw right through it. And then it's also it's a media critique. It's a critique of higher education. It's a critique of Kinsey. It's a critique of Freud and his American counterparts. What else does it critique? I mean, it's very broad-reaching.
Very broad, yeah.
Yeah. And but you're absolutely right to use the word Emersonian, because the amazing first paragraph about all of the things that housewives do and how isolated they are, and then the amazing last section of the book where it invokes the imagination, right? It talks about women's imagination and how that's where their liberation will come from. That to me is very moving and still current.
Yes, I want to just tell everybody about this article I read in the Washington Post. Maybe some of you saw it, but I thought if only Betty Friedan were here, she would just plot. It was called "Millennials Are Tired of Trying to Be Perfect Moms," and this was published 2 weeks ago. And it's an article about you know, middle class or upper class women who read these mom influencers, and have their mommy blogs and all the rest, and how this makes women with small children feel they can't do enough, they can't do it right. This is a very long article quoting many people. There is one mention of a husband, you know, and I'm thinking they can't all be single moms. But it's just like men are still not part of that discourse, that you know, women are still, they may not even be doing it all, but they're worrying it all. They're the warrior in chief and the feel-badder in chief. And I thought, Betty, thou shouldst be living at this hour. We need you.
Yes, we do need her. I agree 100%, because I often see articles like the one you're talking about, like 5 female professors suing Vassar.
Can you believe it?
Right, Vassar of all places, right? Or the UN talking, you know, there was a UN report about how women will not be able to achieve equality by 2030, contrary to what had been predicted at some time prior. I mean, so I feel like one of the issues is that we have not fulfilled what Betty imagined for us.
Another thing I did was I'm on a listserv or in a group of women many of whom knew Betty, who are a little older than me. So I emailed them to say, what are your thoughts? So Muriel Fox, who was like the right-hand woman, the right-hand woman. What's the matter with me? The right-hand fox of Betty Friedan said, "I hope you'll stress that we all agreed that Betty is the one who did it." I thought that, you know, sometimes you need to be a very problematic, difficult, high-energy, anxious person to do what needs to be done.
Yes, and remember, this was the late 50s and early 60s when no one was thinking about women as a category.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of that.
It's amazing. So the degree to which she had to shout, you know, I'm putting it in scare quotes, but she did actually shout, but then also just the figurative shouting that happened in those different rooms. I don't think that should be underestimated or forgotten.
Mm-hmm. And then Marilyn Webb, who is a famous feminist, said she was not a nice person, but she accomplished so much.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that also got me thinking, what do you think about this, Rachel? How nice does a woman have to be?
Well, I mean, but I don't know, Katha. I can't even answer that. Like, I feel like our biographers of great male figures, are those figures required to be nice? I do feel like this is a gender standard.
I was trying to think of men who are as problematic and difficult and hard to get along with and shouty and argumentative and all the rest of it as Betty.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are many.
I mean, I don't know about that, but I think male figures who are in the public eye have other problems.
Right.
I think the issue of being nice might be unique to women. I mean, Betty also, I want to say that she was self-aware, although she couldn't control herself. She couldn't stop being the way that she was. And, but she knew, for example, that, you know, she was not necessarily the best and most democratically minded person to lead the National Organization for Women. She was the first president of NOW, as you know, for 4 years. And when she was tapped for that, she said she tried to resist because she had a writer's temperament, and she talks about having a writer's temperament.
Yeah.
But then people just kept coming to her, and they kept asking her, and they kept saying, "You're the person." You know.
I guess with men, it's the added complication of girlfriends and being rapists and that kind of
Yeah.
sex stuff.
Yeah, maybe that. Right, maybe that. I don't know if not. Right, I don't know if the issue is being nice or not nice. But I agree. This is something that Betty had to contend with
Yeah.
her whole life, and it followed her whole life. I don't know if I think that it followed her fairly or not. I mean, I certainly, obviously, I can't argue with what Marilyn or Muriel say. I mean, I heard that maybe a million times while writing the book, that kind of remark.
Let's see. I just want to. Yeah, Alex Schulman says, despite her difficulty, and difficulty is in quotes, she was a tremendous force.
Yeah.
Heather Booth says, like many leaders, she was a difficult person who struggled every step of her way and so drove forward, often without considering the feelings of others.
Yeah.
She surely changed the world and each of our lives. And I found myself thinking of, you know, our politicians, you know, who are often horrible people and really mean to their staff. And it's the women that get in trouble for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amy Klobuchar. Remember?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But some others as well. And God forbid they have someone on their staff who's a sexual harasser. They get blamed for it and they have to step down.
Right.
So, you know, you can see that Betty was up against a lot.
Yes.
And probably the only person who has escaped that kind of critique is Gloria Steinem,
Yes.
her rival, quote
Yes.
unquote,
Yes.
who is just a lovely person.
Yes.
A lovely person who is always thinking of others and
Right.
manages to not have big fights.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she took the high road. Gloria always took the high road in every time and Betty would not do that. She would not take the high road. So there were numerous occasions in the particularly in the early 70s when Betty would talk to the media about Gloria and say really, I don't know, mean things about her.
Yeah.
And Gloria would never respond.
This is something I've always been curious about. Do you think that, I'm trying to put this in a really diplomatic way, but I mean, Betty was not a conventionally attractive woman.
Yeah.
Do you think that that played a role in the way she was seen as a public person?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think for one thing, since her childhood, she was aware of how she looked. Because she wanted to be an actress when she was a young person, and she knew she talks about being not pretty enough to be an actress. And also from her childhood, she threw fits. She had these fits as a child as a way to kind of, push her mother away and kind of gain independence from her mother or to do various things. So I think from my perspective, those came from a kind of insecurity about her physical appearance.
Because there were a lot of catty remarks.
Many.
From fashion editors when she would show up in some dress they didn't like. They always made much of that.
Yes, I mean, that was standard in journalism. It's unbelievable when you read it that she would then have to read about herself some of these things about her dress or her hair or whatever. Even I think on the women's strike for equality, one of the most important events of second wave feminism, which Betty is responsible for, the New York Times ran a piece about how she was late for an interview because she was at Vidal Sassoon getting her hair done. Right? You know, I mean, that's incredible.
Right. Yeah, if with a man you have to have John Edward levels of hair issues. Or, remember him with his $400 haircuts?
Yeah.
Now it would probably be a lot more than that. Cut off cheaply. You say she would be canceled today.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, just as I said before, I mean, I think she was not interested in what we call identity politics today at all. She,
Feminism is identity politics.
yeah, she was interested in the category of woman. She was interested in half of the human race, which was women, but she was not interested in identity as sexual liberation, which radical feminism was really promoting in the late 60s. And she was not interested in Black power feminism at all. And so she, you know, she really tried to discourage lesbian women, for example. You know, I'm sure you know the
Lavender Menace.
the infamous remark that she made in 1969, right? The Lavender Menace, which really haunted her for the rest of her life. Women would come up to her at events and say, remember, you in 1969, you used that remark, the Lavender Menace, although she actually apologized for it in 1977. But so I think that's a big thing, is her insistence on class and representation and pay, equal pay, a kind of equality that people just, to me, don't seem that interested in today.
Well, you know, what was it? That, okay, toward feminism's real goals, workplace rights, childcare centers, and free abortion available to all.
Yeah.
And I would say, except for workplace rights, where I think we have come,
You think we have come
I think we've come
forward.
farther than she thinks so, because she, according to you, thought Me Too was just one of these sex things.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think it's a workplace rights issue. But the other things, free abortion available to all, please, you know, and childcare centers, those are closing. So I think in some ways we've gone backwards.
Right. Right.
But it's interesting. One thing I was interested in, I'd like you to talk about, is that she changed her mind a lot. For someone who has a reputation for being very rigid and stuck in the 60s, stuck at the moment she wrote that book, and went on to write, you know, many, many more books, she changed her mind a lot. For example, she thought in the year 2000, she says, oh, the women's movement, they're always talking about abortion. Let's get off the dime and talk about something else. Abortion is safe. I'm thinking, oh, Betty, come on. It might have looked that way in 2000, but, you know, things changed. So how do you see her evolving?
Oh, I'm glad you used that word, because I think that she did evolve. I'm not sure about that event in 2000. I don't know if I can comment specifically on that, because by 2000, she died in 2006. And by 2000, I'm not sure that she was altogether there. I'm just not, I'm not sure, you know, I think she was maybe fading a little bit. Yeah, so I'm not saying that it's directly, that remark is directly attributable to that, but I certainly think she evolved. Like, I'm thinking more of, for example, as we've been talking about the feminine mystique and how it is really a product of the 50s, and she tried to address people's criticisms of the feminine mystique, because people criticized it right when it was published and said, oh, you didn't talk about any working class women, you didn't talk about any Black women. And she tried to address that. And how she did that was she started working on another book, her second book, which was called, it had a few different titles. One was The Fourth Dimension, okay, and but it was about women after the feminine mystique, and she really tried to make it much more diverse. And then she tried to make Now diverse. It didn't always work, but that was her goal. Her goal for Now was to get women from many different backgrounds into a room and have them talk to each other, and out of that would come a certain strength. So I think that she did evolve somewhat when she was criticized. At the same time, though, I also think she became maybe more conservative, certainly in the 80s, in the 1981, when she wrote The Second Stage, which is the book where she talks about how feminism has gone too far, and there's a feminist mystique as opposed to a feminine mystique. That book got a lot of flack for being a kind of conservative pamphlet, really. So I guess I think there's different ways. Some ways she evolved seem to me to be more an opening up, and then others seem to be the opposite of that. I'm not sure there's like one, one kind of clear thing.
Do you think that her becoming more, quote, conservative, unquote, what was that in response to? Was that in response to her being sort of pushed out of the women's movement?
Partly that. I mean, look, I think also when she wrote The Feminine Mystique, she was, that was in, it came out in 1963. She was born in 1921. And there were, when Now was founded, she was already in her late 40s. And a lot of the women who were coming into the women's were much, much, much younger. And so she was more concerned. She was a mother with 3 children, and they were single women trying to figure out their sexuality. It was a generational thing. So I think it was a generational thing, but I also think she was from a small town in the Midwest, and I think she also had a conservative streak to her.
It's interesting you say that, because before she wrote The Feminine Mystique, she was, among other gigs, a writer for the UE, which was one of the most radical unions. My father.
Your father, yes.
And it was, wonderful union. But so she wrote for them. So she was, I mean.
Yes.
What is it? Daniel Horowitz.
Yes, Daniel Horowitz. Yes.
Daniel Horowitz blamed her.
Yes.
For covering up, as he saw it.
Yes.
Her radical roots.
Yes.
In order to be more bestseller worthy.
Yes, or not to alienate. I think other groups.
So why do you think she did? See, she knew a lot of working class women. She knew a lot of black women, and she moved in that world. Why did she focus on middle class women?
In The Feminine Mystique? Well, actually, if you look at the archives and the drafts of The Feminine Mystique, there are some places that did not make it to the final manuscript, the final published book, where she does talk about black women and she does talk about working class women, but those were cut. Right, so that's one thing. I mean,
she cut them, or did the editor
not clear. It's not clear from the archives who cut them. But the book was already, as you mentioned, super long. So I think my feeling was that the editor wanted to make it about women, right, and not about anything else. But she had an enormous arc, right, as you say, starting with UE, and then moving through in the 50s. She worked for general interest women's magazines, and she wrote a lot of, she wrote cover stories, she wrote profiles, she wrote all sorts of things.
I think you said you wanted to read a passage.
Oh, I did. Okay, sure.
Great.
Yeah, I wanted to read a short thing from the women's strike, actually.
1970.
Yeah, 1970, and so just a little bit of background about this is that Betty was president of Now from 1966 to 1970, and then she was not re-upped for another 4 years, or the what do you call it? The bylaws of now did not allow that, and so she flew to the Now conference, which was outside of Chicago, and she delivered a very long exit speech. And then at the end of that speech, she announced that even though she was stepping down, she wanted there to be, this was in March of 1970, and so she wanted there to be this national event, which was the Women's Strike for Equality in 5 months. And there was media there, and so you can imagine what all the other Now officials thought about this, right? As she was shook, she was basically saying, and there's going to be this amazing event, and you all have to put it all together, right? Because I'm stepping down from as president. And so the next 5 months, everybody worked really hard, and it did come together to be this amazing event. And so what I want to read is just a little bit from what that was like, what the event was like. It was in August of 1970. In the morning, Friedan stopped by a model child care center, a baby inn set up on New York City's City Hall lawn. Women had parked baby carriages nearby. Someone hung lollipops from tree branches. Betty gave a short speech about women's rights while the press took notes. Next, on to the Social Security building at Federal Plaza. About 25 demonstrators milled about. Friedan banged on the doors. "We are Americans, even though we are women," she proclaimed, insisting that they had as much right to pay taxes as men. She had lunch at the bar of the Wall Street restaurant White's, drinking a whiskey sour and eavesdropping on financiers' conversations. She had wanted the final leg of the march to start in Harlem to make black women feel central, but instead, at 5 p.m., female and some male marchers gathered at Fifth Avenue and Central Park South near the Plaza Hotel. Some women were putting up a symbolic statue of Sojourner Truth, and a steel band played. Making her way uptown, Friedan boarded a bus where women kept coming up to her to hug her. Traffic was so bad that she got off to walk the last 5 blocks. As she approached 59th Street, she saw a sea of women. The strike began to hum, finally starting at around 6. It stretched across Fifth Avenue, although Mayor Lindsay, worried about rush hour, had only issued a permit for 1 lane of traffic. But the women took the whole street. Despite boycotting Cosmo, Friedan walked alongside Helen Gurley Brown, as well as her beloved judge and first-wave feminist friend, Dorothy Kenyon, now 82 years old. Shauna Alexander, Eleanor Holmes Norton, then New York City Commissioner on Human Rights, and Gloria Steinem were all there. They moved downtown, following the route the suffragists took 55 years earlier. Some women dashed onto the formerly men-only bar at the plaza. Others carried a banner, "Women of the World Unite." Marchers held placards with slogans like, "Don't iron while the strike is hot," and "No Vietnamese ever called me chick." Still others yelled, "Join us." A few women paused to cut up a midi skirt in front of Bonwit Teller. Horns blared and some men heckled, but onlookers mostly cheered. Finally, they came to 41st Street, where a line of horses and cops in riot gear stood. They pressed on.
Wow.
Exciting.
Wow, those were the days.
Those are the days, right? I mean, it's so exciting.
Great. This I wanted to ask you about, well, this is a big question. Why do you talked about matricide. You talked about something in the women's movement that causes women to disown the past, the heroes of the past, and the ideas of the past. And that made me think about the Women's March and how that's sort of, it's not an example of that, but it's an example of how hard it is to get women, half of humanity, to unite around just a few simple ideas. You wouldn't think it would be that hard, and yet in real life it's incredibly hard, and these things tend to blow up. And people, like the Women's March was the biggest march in American history, when it happened at the day after the inauguration of the former guy, as our president calls him. It lasted for about 3 years, and then it blew up in, all kinds of accusations and scandals. Why is that different from other movements? But we notice it more because it's women, and we have, as with the niceness thing, we have higher expectations of women, of sisterhood, of we're all in this together, let's not fight. If women fight, it's called a cat fight. When men fight, it's not called a dog fight. It's just men being men. So what do you have thoughts about that matricide thing that you raised?
I think because there's not legislative progress made. And so we can't ever, it feels like we can't ever advance. We're spinning our wheels, so we slide back. That's the only way I can explain it. What's your explanation for it?
I guess I think it's a little bit like the world of poetry. It's a small pie, and everybody wants a piece, and it's hard to. I think that women have had trouble articulating their own ambition as part of what they're doing. And so it's always presented as altruistic, but sometimes it's not. There's a new book about the early years of the National Organization for Women that goes into some of the infighting. I haven't read it yet, so I don't want to say too much about it, but I think that that's kind of endemic. Look at the Democratic Party. Look at the Republicans. My God. Or look at Congress. People fight. People want recognition, power, fame, money, all those things. But they're not allowed to say they want that if they're doing an altruistic thing. So I think that's part of it. But I think also that the ideas of what freedom for women are changed. I don't think that today's women's movement is recognizable to the world of the feminine mystique. It's all about, trans and drag queens and sex work is work. A lot of it is about sex that she would have been completely horrified by. I think part of it is what you're saying, though, is that we've made so little progress on the bedrock economic issues that people go off into language, they go off into culture,
Right.
all that.
I have another thought, which is Betty was very clear that she wanted the women's movement to be, she wanted men to be in partnership with women. She did not see men as the enemy. And as you know, many radical feminists who succeeded her or who came, who were coming up in the late 60s did not share that. But I do think that in Betty's idea of feminism, it's because, who is the enemy? Like, it's easier to fight if you're in a social movement, right? It's easier to fight if there's a clear idea of who the enemy is. So if it's not men, then who is it? It's some abstraction like the government. Capitalism, right.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't think that's right. I don't know if that's gonna go very far. Yeah.
But isn't it funny that we've been talking about how in some ways that world of the feminine mystique is unrecognizable because there has been so much progress. We wouldn't be sitting here.
True.
And half the people in this audience would be making dinner for
Right.
the other half.
True.
But, and in other ways, it feels like so many bedrock things have not changed.
Right. Yes.
Bedrock expectations of women, the whole money issue.
Yes.
And ways in which life has changed that it's harder for women.
Yes.
So it's there's still lots of work to be done. I want to ask you one more question, or maybe a few more questions. But one of them is, this is published in the Jewish Lives series.
Yes.
A really excellent series of books from Yale. And could you talk a little bit about her relationship to Judaism.
Yes. Well, so she grew up in Peoria, Illinois, and her mother was very concerned with. They were not a particularly religious family. They were Reform, but her mother was really mostly concerned with the surface appearance of things in a town where there was anti-Semitism. They were very concerned with fitting in. And I do think that that shaped Betty and caused her to rebel against that. She had a very strong sense of not wanting to fit in the way her mother had wanted her to fit in. And then it was not, however, it was not really until she was in her 60s that she began to have more of a sense of herself as a Jew, as somebody who wanted to explore organized Judaism and go to Israel and see where anti-Semitism existed in the women's movement, for example. Those were all things that she began to explore in the 1970s, the mid-1970s. So she had a complex trajectory through Judaism.
Did she believe in God?
Katha, let's see. I don't know. I think she believed in something, I do. Yeah.
And the something was Jewish.
Yeah, and the something was Jewish. The
something.
something was Jewish. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
All right.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that's a little confusing.
Yeah.
Is there anybody in the world now that reminds you of Betty Friedan, or was she kind of unique to her time and place?
There's nobody that reminds me of Betty Friedan. I mean, I think what you were talking about earlier about her power and just her, and the quotes from Muriel and the others about how she could get things done.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody like that.
How did she do that?
Just the sheer force of her will.
I see.
Yeah.
But there are people with sheer force of will now.
I don't know. They aren't also at the same time able to get people excited about a better world. People have the will to change things perhaps, but I mean, I don't know anybody who also can get people excited about this vision.
Yeah. So she, in a way, what you're saying, what I hear you saying is she had this fantastic will, this ability, however, whether or not people liked her, to make them do things.
Yes.
What a gift. But it was also a time of great optimism in America.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
It was the beginning of the 60s, and so you could dream of a better world. I mean, my God, I remember in the early 70s thinking every generation is going to raise its children better than the generation before. I have no idea if that is true. I mean, I hope I've done a better job with my daughter than my parents did with me, but they did their best. They tried, and they were, better than, previous generations. So there was a little bit of truth to what I was saying, what I was thinking, but that sense of we're looking at kind of a really good future. I think nobody feels that now.
No.
I mean, and it's not just global warming, it's so many things. So she came along at a time when, she could push the boulder up the hill.
Yes.
That then came
Then
down, but she was
came.
dead by then. So,
Yeah.
well, this is just a wonderful book. Everyone should read it. And you'll learn a lot about women, about this fascinating woman, but also about a very interesting time in American life. And I wish we had that optimism again.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. So, questions?
Thanks, Katha. Thank you.
Oh, but can I just say, because I'm terrified that I'll forget to say this, that I want to thank Shelby White and the Leon Levy Center for Biography for hosting this event. We are so lucky to have this wonderful center right here in New York. What if it was in Peoria? Lucky for them, but not for us. So, are there questions?
Questions?
I wrote a biography of Gloria Steinem. I'm Sydney Stern, and I interviewed you, Katha.
did?
And yes, and I quoted you.
Oh,
And I had to check your quote with you, too.
well, I am losing my mind. What can I
Well,
say?
no, why would you remember that? But I can't wait to read your book. I'm sorry I haven't read it yet, but I look forward to it. I, of course, spent a lot of time thinking about the differences and everything. And I thought one of the interesting things today was when you ask feminists of the second wave, only Muriel was part of the Betty wing. The others were radicals, Alex Shulman, et cetera. And now they're being very positive about Betty, which they were not at that time.
Right.
I don't know if you found that in your interviews that people have softened on.
Yes, they did soften, and I also think Betty softened at the end of her life, and most people agree, like with that idea, and would talk about her generosity in certain ways. I don't know, after 1999 or something like that. So I think there was a kind of I don't know, not a rapprochement, but some kind of détente or something.
Well, I look forward to reading about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wonder if there should be sort of one replacement for Betty Friedan, or if maybe that was part of the problem of the women's movement, of the second wave women's movement, is depending on too few women to lead the movement rather than conceiving of it more broadly as, in the sort of Adrienne Marie Brown emergent strategy model of a lot of different people doing a little bit of work. And if you ever get a chance to hear her speak, she's also somebody who I think could, be as inspiring in a lot of ways as Betty Friedan was.
Say her name again so everyone can hear.
Adrienne Marie Brown, and her book is Emergent Strategy.
Okay. I think there was a hand up back there. Yeah? The person with the, back there.
I'm sorry I came very late, so this question may be redundant in that you may have discussed it, but in your question of the author about who would replace her now, aren't we slipping, it sort of follows on the point that was just made. It seems to me worrisome to follow the notion of the great man theory of history or the great woman theory of history. It isn't a person, it's really a person who might stand out, but she never could have done what she did by herself. And I think we fall into the trap, especially when we read biography, of thinking that the person about whom we're reading or about whom we're speaking has much more power than he or she does. They're always part of a surround and a context. And as you said, we're in a different time in terms of action and activism on the streets. And many of us women feel that there are more important things that come first, such as the President of the United States, such as, the Ukraine and Russia. My only point is that I think we shouldn't look for the great man, great woman. I think it holds us back.
I want to hear what you have to say about that.
I hear that definitely. That was a criticism that was made, even going back to the 70s, right?
We're always going on about
Yeah,
how
yeah.
you're just paying attention to the people, get the media attention. That
Yeah,
was
yeah.
something people said about Gloria.
Yeah, yeah, and Betty. I mean, that there were four. Why did people only know four women from the second wave when it was a grassroots movement? Absolutely. I don't know. On the other hand, I mean, Betty was once asked about this, and she said something like, "This is America. In order to get things done, you have to have stars," or something. And that's actually what she said. That may be unpalatable, but she believed it. She believed it. She believed to get things done, you had to go to the Hamptons and have a big starry fundraiser for the women's strike, and you had to get really wealthy people interested in your cause. I mean, I'm just describing, you know, I think it's,
Well, I don't think that's
yeah,
changed.
yeah.
I mean, now it's just who the stars are. It's,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at the power of celebrity,
Mm-hmm.
which was nothing then like it is today, I mean, it's astonishing. I mean, just go on Twitter and that's what people are talking about. But don't go on Twitter. You'll waste your life. Yeah, but sometimes I think that the de-emphasis on the great woman theory is a way of, you know what they say, cutting down the tall poppies, that it's a way of denying that some people are just really talented and really good at what they do, and they are more important for a movement than somebody who just goes to a couple of meetings. There's a very interesting book, which you have probably read, called The Feminist Memoir Project. This was edited by Anne Snitow and Rachel Blau Duplessis. And they went and they got all these activists of the time to write memoirs about their experiences and also what they have been doing since. And what was really interesting was that they were, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them were kind of frozen in that moment. They were unable to move beyond it. They were unable to admit that they had really accomplished anything, you know. They were unable to admit that things had gotten better. And a lot of them were really struggling in life. They gave up a lot. They gave up, you know, if you give up like 10 years of your life, of formative years of your life from when you're like 25 to 35, it's really hard to get back into normal bourgeois society. And so they had not been able to do that. It's a fascinating book, and it says so much about those times and what came after. Now, I think there was somebody,
Yeah, I have a question. And the mic.
yeah, oh,
Was there some incident or revelation or something that led to the book, or was it a culmination of Betty's life experience, or what?
I'm sorry, was there an incident that led to my writing the book?
No, it led to her writing
Oh,
the
led to
book.
her writing The Feminine Mystique?
Yes.
Yeah, there were a couple of different things. What were they? She. I mean, it's hard to really pinpoint. I mean, I think the major thing was, well, she went to Smith College, and then she went to her 15-year reunion at Smith College, and she was struck by how few of the women were still in the workforce, how many of them had gone back and become housewives. And she felt that it was a wasted education. And so she began to investigate that, and she tried to write an article about it, and she had a lot of trouble selling the article. And one editor tried to completely rewrite the article, and then, you know, but she kept working on it. She was very persistent. And so eventually that became The Feminine Mystique.
One more question? It's probably the last.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this. Could you talk a little bit about her involvement or the extent of her involvement in electoral politics in the Democratic Party? I mean, she knew Shirley Chisholm and Patsy Mink, I'm sure.
Yes.
Did she campaign for people and women in 1992, the Year of the Women? And how involved was she in the ERA as well? And did she ever consider running for office?
Okay, that's three questions. Okay, one, she co-founded an organization called the National Women's Political Caucus, I think in 1971 with Bella and Gloria, and that was devoted to electoral politics. And okay, what were the other two questions? I'm sorry, the ERA. Okay, the ERA, yes, she was extremely involved in the ERA, and she was devastated when it did not come to fruition. I mean, as she did for every cause she was involved in, she threw herself into it. She flew all over the country talking about it. She wrote pieces about it. Yeah, she was very, very, very involved in that. And then, did she consider running for office? Yes, she wanted to run for office, but her temper was well known, and so I think that no one took that. No one took that up. No one took it seriously.
Of course, now that wouldn't matter. You can just be anybody and get to be president.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Thad.
Rachel is going to be signing and selling books back here. So thank you, Katha, and thank you, Rachel.
Katha,
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you. Thank you.